So, Luke, we should get started. We're left the obligatory few minutes for people to come online, but here we are. So, we were talking about previous competitions, and when did you first get into CCS then?
It was actually back in 2005 when I was working for an organisation called IPECA, and yeah, they were quite interested in CCS. They just produced their first report, and then I joined CCSA 2009, which has gone shockingly quickly.
Yeah, well, so 2009. That was a bit before the first competitions ended, but not long, right?
Yes, I think the first one ended, was it October 2010?
Yeah.
I have all of these dates kind of scarred into my psyche.
Yeah.
Like many people.
Yeah, and how would you say the membership's gone up and down since then?
So actually, I should try and dig it out somewhere. I actually mapped membership across sentiment on CCS, and it tracked very, very well. But what's really interesting, I was predicting hopefully quite strong growth in membership this year. I mean, obviously the COVID crisis materialized, and I thought, this will be very interesting. And what is really interesting is that actually membership's still going up, even given all of the uncertainties around there. So I think that signifies just how seriously this is on the agenda now, which is, I think, really good news. And I think that's also reinforced by some of the developments that we've seen in Norway with Northern Lights. Even in a world where we have the COVID crisis, going to have very steep recessions. We've had a massive drop in oil prices. Actually, a number of companies are still making investments in CCS, so that's really promising.
Yes. And then, I mean, before 2005, what was you sort of doing then? What was you?
A biologist.
A biologist. Okay.
Yes, yeah. Doing a PhD, and then by the end of my PhD, I was desperate to get as far away from academia as humanly possible. I shouldn't actually say that on this call, should I? I decided I wasn't cut out to be an academic, so I applied to go try and work on environmental issues, but with industry.
You got CCS instead, yeah.
Yeah, I ended up on climate change and in the oil and gas sector, and CCS came onto my agenda.
Let's go back a little bit more. What was your PhD?
It was in the biogenic transformation of organic matter in lowland permeable catchments. So looking at chalk streams and how particles move through chalk streams.
Oh, that's great. It must be pleasant field work anyway.
It was lovely, yes. I'd spend a week a month down in Dorset.
And Britain is fairly unique in chalk stream environments, isn't it, globally?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
They have very unusual characteristics compared to most river systems.
Yeah. Oh, well, maybe that's a plan B to go back to. That sounds like
Indeed.
Pleasant, really, didn't it? So 2009, you took over. The membership's gone up and down. What do you think the high points have been since 2009 for you? Or is it a new high point every day now with things on the up?
It feels easier now than it's ever felt. I sometimes describe it, it's like for the first time, it's like running downhill. You just really feel that, with, the wider political commitment to net zero, with that starting to be internalized within governments, within industrial regions, within the companies, with people's understanding of the type of actions that we need to transition to net zero, starting to become much more sophisticated. CCS is just a much easier conversation now. So it's, I'm probably enjoying it more now than I ever have.
And you think it's more than, for example, 2010 when we got the energy bill through, Energy Act, and have the CCS levy? I mean, it seemed pretty good then. It was.
But actually you realised, well, the world was going through big changes then, wasn't it?
Like it isn't now,
Very true. But actually, back then, coming out of 2008, 2009, we were in a paradigm where CCS was all about new coal generation. And around that time, it was all shifting with shale gas starting to come onto the agenda in the US. The economics of coal versus gas really started to shift, started to see the massive investments into renewables. And so that kind of really challenged, that particular foundation for the program at the time. Whereas now, I think it's a much deeper story. With obviously, the power generation is still there. It's a different role from what we thought 10 years or so ago, but the industry piece is there. We have hydrogen now coming onto the agenda, and how that potentially can start to contribute to decarbonisation of buildings, transport, negative emissions. I mean, even though we don't really seem to see enough activity at the government level around greenhouse gas removals, we all understand they're going to be important. So there's many
a lot about
strings.
BECCS, really, when you get down to it. I mean, it's there, isn't it? BECCS seems to be on there.
Yes, but I think GGR's kind of more widely. It's just an issue that nobody's really starting to tackle. And even if you look at the UK context, which department really has responsibilities for GGRs? It doesn't really sit neatly within BAYS. It doesn't sit neatly within DFT. So there is an issue about a lack of ownership there.
Yeah. So my cat's coming to pester me. Yeah, that's a very good point. And yes, it is interesting, isn't it? Oh well, that's maybe something to look at and get a defined responsibility.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the wider public narrative around GGRs is very unsophisticated. It's either perceived as being a moral hazard. The assumption is that if you're pursuing GGRs, then you're going to be doing less mitigation. But there seems to be some kind of direct trade-off there, which I'm not sure is correct. Or the other assumption seems to be that you do GGRs very late in the 2040s.
Yeah.
But actually, given the scale of the GGRs needed, we need to be getting started much more quickly.
Yes. Well, and if people want to do it now, it's clearly all to the good, isn't it? You pay for it. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's given the people a pretty good idea of where you're coming from. I suppose you could argue a chalk stream is CO2, isn't it? Certainly the calcium carbonate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And now spearheading the UK's activities on CCS and with a growing membership. So, Luke, you want to give us your presentation, and then we'll carry on with the discussion afterwards. And just reminding the audience, if you've got questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end. We won't forget them. Okay, Luke.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you. And can you see that yet? Has that come up?
Not yet.
Oh, not yet. No. Okay, sorry. I'm not quite the expert on Zoom. I'm more of a Microsoft Teams chap.
Very good.
It's come up now.
Okay, wonderful. Great stuff. So I was approached, I guess just week before last, and invited to give a presentation to you. And the timing was excellent in that we at the CCSA had just undertaken a piece of work looking at CCUS and how it fits in to the post-COVID recovery. So what I'm going to do over the next, however long it takes, is talk you through some of the work that we're doing in this space, because I think potentially this has quite serious implications for the interest in carbon capture and storage. So I'll just try and move the slides on. Is it like that? Oh, there we go. Excellent. Right. So basically, I mean, as I think we're all aware, over the last few months, government's priorities have been absolutely focused on addressing the COVID-19 crisis, and quite rightly so. But what I think we have started to see, particularly in the last 5 to 6 weeks, is a real focus now on starting to think about how society is going to emerge from this crisis, and lots of talk now around a recovery package. And I think it's certainly clear that within the UK context, as being at least relevant to that conversation. And there's actually been a number of kind of very interesting statements that have been made by ministers over the last few weeks. So for those of you who have been avid viewers of the UK government's COVID briefings, which are held every afternoon, no doubt you would have been flabbergasted 3 weeks ago to have seen the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, mention CCS twice in relation to how the government was going to respond to COVID, once in the context of climate change and once in the context of creating jobs in our industrial region. So I think a really excellent sign that CCS seems to be front and centre of the Chancellor's mind. For those of you who aren't students of UK government structure, the Minister with key responsibility for CCS is Kwasi Kwarteng. He sits within BEIS, and he hosted a industrial energy stakeholder forum about 4 weeks ago, and was just remarkably clear there that the government intends to be very proactive in terms of the post-COVID recovery, but they would only be looking to use the government's balance sheet to support organisations and companies that were aligned with UK government's goals on net zero. And he, on a number of occasions, also made a link there between CCUS and hydrogen. And then what we also see is a frequent reference to this from UK government officials as well, who are also very focused on this recovery package and now make frequent references to the need for a resilient green recovery. So it's clearly an issue that is very much on the agenda domestically, and I think there's also some very helpful pressure here starting to be applied externally as well. You will have no doubt just seen a recent Scottish Government's announcement on its Energy Transition Fund. So that's 62 million going into a number of activities, but they also include CCUS and hydrogen. And then we've also seen actually a very large number of announcements being made around Europe on low carbon technologies, in particular with a very strong focus on hydrogen. And so again, I think that's also helped to grab the attention of UK policymakers to ensure that they can also contribute to this conversation going forward. And the general speculation, and it is only speculation, seems to be that there may be some kind of announcement around a COVID recovery package in early July, with a lot of the sensible money seeming to be on the early part of the week commencing the 6th of July. So next few weeks are really going to be very interesting indeed. So obviously, from the CCSA's perspective, we're very keen to make sure that our interests are understood or communicated into this conversation. So we've just released our paper on setting out how we believe both CCUS and the newly announced CCS Infrastructure Fund can make a contribution to this resilient green recovery. And we've really focused it on the following 4 areas. Firstly, trying to set out what we actually believe is an appropriate level of ambition for CCUS deployment by 2030. We've made some suggestions for what an appropriate strategy should look like, how CCS actually can contribute to a green recovery, and then also some specific recommendations for how the infrastructure fund can support this outcome. And that paper's been shared quite widely across government. So it's gone to Minister Kwarteng in BEIS, the Exchequer Secretary Kemi Badenoch in Treasury, into special advisors in number 10. And then we've also shared it with quite a number of other MPs and other external groups who are also trying to feed in to this conversation. And generally actually received very positive reactions to a number of the recommendations there. So what I'd like to do now then is just really kind of talk you through the case we're making to government. We really just want to, in the first instance, just kind of ensure that everyone understands actually, what's the outcome we're trying to deliver here. So I mean, I'm sure this is not news for a lot of you, but if the UK is going to deliver on net zero, and the Committee on Climate Change believes that we may need to be storing somewhere between 75 to 175 million tonnes of CO2 a year in 2050. And in many ways, it doesn't matter what the ultimate number is. The reality is that we've got 30 years to be starting to store many tens of millions of tonnes of CO2 every year. And when we look at progress in other sectors, what we see is that typically sectors take a long time to scale up to be able to deliver material abatement. So for offshore wind, where the UK prides itself on being a world leader on offshore wind, it took us almost 20 years to develop an offshore wind sector that was abating around 10 million tonnes of CO2. And so the point that we would emphasise very strongly is that we really do need to see a step change in terms of the UK's ambition on CCS if we're going to be getting ourselves onto a trajectory that's consistent with net zero. And the next 10 years are shaping up to be really important. But just a couple of other reflections as well. So in addition to the level of abatement required in 2050, we also need to be bringing forward a very large amount of storage capacity. The cumulative storage capacity required out to 2050 could be somewhere between 1 gigaton to potentially 2 gigatons. We have the capacity, but we need to make sure we've got the policies in place that can enable that capacity to come forward when it's required. There's also an issue here around the geographical distribution of this infrastructure. So for those of you that know UK geography well, our industrial clusters are located around the coast. And so we really need to be developing the infrastructure that is located in our main storage provinces in both the central and southern North Sea, as well as the East Irish Sea, so that we can start to tie that infrastructure into our major industrial clusters. And then also we believe that CCUS will be needed to support the decarbonisation of multiple sectors. So there'll be a role for CCS in power, in abating industrial emissions, in producing low carbon hydrogen, which can then start to decarbonise potentially buildings or transport, etc. And then also, as we were just discussing, as an important enabler for greenhouse gas removals. So that's where we need to be in 2050. And therefore, what we're proposing is that the government needs to adopt a very clear 2030 target. And we've argued that the government should be adopting the Committee on Climate Change's recommendation that we store at least 10 million tonnes by 2030. In addition to that, what we need to do is we need to start to put in place the initial infrastructure in each of those storage regions that we discussed earlier. So what's the benefit then of adopting a 10 million tonne target? Well, CCS is technology we're going to need to deploy at scale. So we really need to start to get some practical experience with operating CCS projects at scale. And I think 10 million tonnes would certainly qualify as at scale deployment and would give us some very valuable early economies of scale, but also some practical learnings that will be very useful for subsequent phases of deployment. In addition, 10 million tonnes also implies that you'll be capturing CO2 over this kind of first period from a number of different sectors. And that's very helpful in terms of starting to get practical experience of applying CCUS value chains to a number of emitting sectors. We have very much emphasised that the 10 million tonnes should be a minimum level, if you like, a deployment floor. And the benefits of having a floor is that as you progress, you're able to also scale that up. And it may well be as we move forward in the 2020s that we realise we really need to be starting to scale up CCS more substantially. But also 10 million tonnes does give you a realistic basis upon which you can then scale up to the type of levels required potentially by net zero in 2050. And the 10 million tonne target for 2030 assumes then that in every 5-year period following on from 2030, you're able to double the installed capacity in order to be able to reach the higher levels of deployment, i.e. close to 175 million tonnes in 2050. We're also arguing that we need free storage regions to be developed. Essentially, if we're able to develop that infrastructure, then we're really starting to create CCUS as a realistic option for many of our industrial regions to begin to decarbonise. But also these regions contain a significant proportion of our storage capacity, and so those early projects can start to be expanded over time in order to deliver the scale of abatement required by 2050. And then finally, by putting in place the infrastructure in multiple regions, we're really going to be starting to create a genuine CCUS market, so stimulating investment, innovation and learning by doing that will then start to drive future cost reductions. So that's where we believe we need to be in 2030. One of the questions that was asked of us is, well, how much is this going to cost? So this table here sets out our views on the likely costs of developing a CCUS sector of 10 million tonnes by 2030. And a couple of key points I'll draw out here is if you look at the investment costs for the infrastructure. So this is the infrastructure that would tie the east coast of Scotland into the central North Sea, the Teesside and Yorkshire Humber clusters into the southern North Sea, and then the development of the East Irish Sea infrastructure. You're looking at approximately 1.8 billion of investment over the 2020s. And what you will then see above here is a selection of capture projects. And this certainly isn't a preferred portfolio capture project, but what we're trying to show is the type of projects that are likely to come forward in the 2020s and provide a kind of a notional portfolio that would deliver you 10 million tonnes of abatement. The total cost of developing a program of this scale in terms of CO2 abated is around £90 a tonne of CO2 abated. That compares quite well with BEI's forecasted carbon prices, which are used for policy appraisal. So by 2030, they show carbon prices in the order of £80 for their central scenario, rising to £120 for their high scenarios. Now, the key point to remember here is that these scenarios at the moment are not yet consistent with net zero. And in a world in which we're, well, where we are today, where we have a legally binding net zero target, the high scenarios are considered to be more aligned with net zero. So even as first phase of CCS development starts to look like it should be cost competitive in 2030. And then the total revenue support needed to support a program of this size based on the mix of projects and infrastructure shown here is around 0.9 billion a year. So just to give you an indication of how that compares to other sectors, it costs the UK somewhere between about 2.3 to 2.8 billion to develop an offshore wind sector of comparable size. So again, it looks like CCS could represent a very good value for money investment. So that's the level of ambition needed to reach 2030. How are we going to get there? Over the last year or so, slightly longer, there's certainly been no shortage of funds that have been announced to try and support industrial decarbonisation, and CCS is typically is eligible as a decarbonisation technologies in all of these funds. So I'll leave you to just read through these ones, but you can see that a substantial number of funds have come out targeting particular sectors or particular parts of the CCUS value chain. Now, what we've then tried to do is basically take our indicative CCS deployment program, map that over the 2020s, start to think about what the investment needs are, and then what the policy requirements are. And this gives you a kind of bit of a sense as to what's going to be needed to support investment in whether it's power, greenhouse gas removals, industry, hydrogen, or potentially the infrastructure going forward. I think another key point to take from this figure here is that if we're going to have very rapid scale up of projects in 2030 onwards, then we need to really be starting to develop a second phase of projects, probably from the mid 2020s at the latest. So we also need to start to think around the policies that can support that second phase of deployment. So what we've then done is started to map the current funds over the different parts of the CCUS value chain. And what you see is that it's a fairly complicated picture. We've got lots of different funds here. So we have the IDC, which can potentially support some of the feed work, hopefully for all parts of the value chain. But then many of the other funds are just targeted at either very specific subsectors of the CCUS value chain, and even within those subsectors, very particular parts of their deployments, with some only supporting potentially feed, others potentially only supporting construction or operation. And what we can conclude from this landscape at the moment is that it's pretty complex. It looks like projects are going to require funding from multiple separate sources of funding. And so that does create some significant coordination risks for project developers trying to access these different funds. At the moment, the route to market for a CCUS project does look to be very uncertain. Now, the possible exception for that is a gas power CCS project, as at the budget in 2020, there was an announcement that they would be able to access a contract for difference. At the moment, also, it's not clear that we necessarily have enough support for feed studies in order to be able to support the progress of sufficient projects to deliver 10 million tonnes by 2030. There's a gap between the CCS infrastructure fund and the total investment needs for that infrastructure. Industrial capital support appears to be reliant on an extension to the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which was announced in the Conservative Manifesto. And we don't have any instruments at the moment that can support GGR technologies or the construction or operation of clear hydrogen, nor for phase 2 projects. So I think this just emphasizes the importance of trying to think about how we can consolidate and rationalize some of the existing funds. I think this is now being recognized by BEIS as being something that does need to be looked at, and there is some work going on in this space, but also then starting to think about how any new funding announcements like the CCS Infrastructure Fund and the work on the business models can be used to help to fill in some of the gaps around the early funding announcements that have been made. So where are we in terms of the current government ambition? So current ambition was set out in the budget at March 2020. It seems like an absolute age away. I mean, that was a material step forward. The Chancellor flagged up there that the UK ambition was to have at least 2 CCS sites operating in the UK, one by the mid-2020s and a second by 2030. Now, our view, though, is that this proposed phasing of projects, which we've called staggered deployment, is suboptimal and potentially could have a negative impact on CCUS deployment. I think where our concerns lie around this approach to deployment is, firstly, there's a risk it delays the realisation of cost reductions. When we look at how to bring the costs of CCUS down, what we see is that economies of scale play a very significant role, as does the de-risking of the framework within a national context. So the de-risking of TNS infrastructure, improved understanding of the commercial models, etc. And so trying to push out the deployment of these projects into the late 2020s and into the 2030s risk delaying some of those cost reductions unnecessarily. We also believe that this approach would signal a government that is still being cautious around CCUS, and that's likely to have a knock-on effect not only in industry, but also in the number of financial institutions that will be wanting to engage in what is in practice a relatively small deployment program. And we're also starting to see significant development in other markets. So there's been a recent positive investment decision in Norway. The Dutch are progressing their support mechanisms for CCUS at pace, and we also have 45Q in the US. And so the UK has this stated ambition of becoming a global leader on CCUS, and we are concerned that this approach to deployment could put that at risk. And also, at this particular point in time, we have an oil and gas sector which is really struggling, and CCUS is a really obvious opportunity to help that sector to diversify into one of the low carbon industries of the future. And then I guess the final point I'd make is, or final 2 points, this type of deployment strategy won't give you any practical learning by doings, as those first 2 projects will overlap anyway. So there doesn't seem to be any clear upside from that particular perspective. And there's also a risk that we start to lock in emissions in the event that we have to build new unabated fossil plants, or that we have, for example, new investment in industrial facilities happening without the ability for them to access CCS. So what we are proposing to the government is that we should be looking at what's worked for offshore wind, and we should be looking to develop something comparable for CCS. And offshore wind was actually in this very difficult situation around 2015, where government was very reluctant to offer long-term support for CCUS, for offshore wind, before they were confident the costs had come down. And then the industry was saying, well, we can't bring our costs down until you enable us to start to deploy. And so, the tool that was used to break that deadlock was what was known as the commit and review policy. And so essentially what the government committed to was a minimum market size for the industry, which was material, but was not over exposing the government. And it really allowed the industry to go out and to develop those projects and then actually demonstrate those cost reductions. And what you then saw is that those cost reductions were realized. That's built government confidence in offshore wind. And then we've had some of the recent announcements, for example, the Conservative manifesto commitment to develop 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. So it's seen as being a great success, and we believe we need this type of policy for CCUS. So what we're asking for is what we're calling our 10 million tonne commit and review policy. So the government commits to deliver 10 million tonnes of abatement through CCS by 2030. And then by guaranteeing that market size there, you've given the industry sufficient volume that it can start to demonstrate practically the cost reduction potentials associated with CCUS. We think from an investor's perspective, they will see this, they will have confidence then in the market opportunities here, they'll be able to understand that market opportunity, and that will attract investors into the UK. But it's also not binding the government unnecessarily. So as we move through into the mid-2020s and we start to think about ambition for 2030, government is able to make an informed decision as to what the right level of CCS deployment would be. It would also send, I think, a very clear signal that the UK wishes to become a world leader in CCUS. It's compliant with our legally binding net zero target, and it's also no regrets. So we can see no way in which 10 million tonnes of storage by 2030 with the associated infrastructure will in any way become stranded, given the volumes we need by 2050. So that's what we're asking for. We've also seen over the last, again, 5 or 6 weeks, a lot of discussion now around supporting a post-COVID economic recovery. So there's been letters that have gone in to Boris Johnson from the Committee on Climate Change, and we've seen a number of reports that have come out of the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Smith School at Oxford University. And what we see when we look at these is that a number of the themes that come out of these recommendations fit very neatly with CCS. So the Committee on Climate Change have highlighted the importance of reskilling and retraining, targeted science and innovation funding, and strengthening energy system networks. So again, CCS can make a contribution to all of those areas. And then Oxford and Grantham have highlighted the importance of recovery policies that deliver both economic growth and address climate change, consider the development of co-benefits, and also areas where government policy can start to drive this change. And there's been a lot of work that's been done around the economic benefits of CCUS. Potentially large numbers of jobs can be associated with both directly with the CCS sector as we move to mid-century, but also in the what are called here the linked economy jobs. So the concept that obviously there'll be the supply chains there, but also by developing a CCUS sector at scale, we'll also be able to host energy intensive industries that otherwise would not be able to be based here in the UK. In terms of co-benefits, some evidence around wider air quality improvements that can be realised from the deployment of CCS, but also, and particularly important for this government, is that CCUS is also seen as being a contributor to what they call their levelling up agenda. So the need to try and support investment in CCUS, investment more generally, I should say, outside of the south of England. And then the final point is that there's clearly a lot of work being done around CCUS policy at the moment that can really help to drive some of these changes into the economy. And then just starting to come to the end of my presentation, so just want to touch on the CCS Infrastructure Fund. So this was announced at the March budget. It's going to be at least £800 million, and it's been set up to deliver the first CCS sites with the purpose of using these to both reduce emissions and establish the new innovative industries of the future. But we've also argued that the CIF, as it's become known, is also very well placed to support the resilient green recovery that the government is starting to consider. So in the UK, we have multiple projects that are ready to progress at pace and would like to be operating by the mid-2020s. And these projects would bring a significant number of jobs in the near term. These are also projects that are outside of the south of England, so they're located in our industrial regions, so they talk to the levelling up agenda, and they also present an important opportunity to support the oil and gas supply chain and help it to diversify. Now, a point I must be at pains to emphasise is that the development of this infrastructure fund is not a replacement for the development of CCUS business models. So there's been a lot of work being done since February really of this year on developing business models for each of the different elements of the CCUS value chain. We see those being as critical as they were before. And so the CIF really needs to be integrated into those business models, specifically to target either investments that can accelerate the delivery of the first projects, or trying to think about investments that can help to accelerate the expansion of those early CCUS clusters. Now, in terms of where we are at present, the government hasn't yet been very clear in terms of its objectives for the infrastructure fund. So we do see this very much as being the start of a dialogue, but we believe there are a number of areas where this fund could usefully be targeted. So in a world in which the government sees the capital investment in T&S being primarily government-led, then we think that the grant could very usefully be targeted at addressing what we call cross-chain risk. So if we put the capital into the T&S, then there's a good opportunity to help mitigate that risk. So the issue of cross-chain risk is where you have a separate investor in the T&S and a separate investor in the capture plant, and there's you develop this project-on-project risk that can be quite challenging to address. So that would make a very useful contribution to CCUS deployment, although the currently announced level of funding is insufficient for the ambition we've set out here. Similarly, the grant could be used to lower the cost of TNS for users of that infrastructure, which would help to reduce first mover disadvantage. Again, a very useful contribution to project deployment, but the current level of funding is also insufficient. A second approach could be around looking at public-private co-investment. So one option is around essentially using the fund to support anticipatory investment in extra capacity within the early infrastructure its development. Again, helping to reduce the risks faced by the first projects in terms of the perception that they're very high cost projects, but can also importantly allow for the subsequent expansion of the industry. And then a kind of general point here around trying to think about how we could then also leverage these public funds to be able to deliver the scale of investment needed to realise all three of the storage infrastructure needs for the UK. There's also potentially other areas that could be targeted. So in terms of feed funding, I think the expectation is that the industrial decarbonisation challenge will provide the majority, if not hopefully all of the funding for this first phase of projects. I think in the event that for some reason it's unable to, then given that this next stage of development for these projects is so critical, then we would argue that a portion of this fund should be used to support those feeds. Two other areas have been identified as potential areas that could be challenging going forward. One is around the ability of energy intensive industries to provide the capital needed for CO2 capture. And so there may well be a case for government co-financing of the capture facilities in order to help early adoption of CCUS in the energy intensive industries. And then finally, there may be some parts of infrastructure which at the moment are not necessarily covered by some of the existing funding packages. So, you know, a very good example of that would be potentially around hydrogen production and distribution, or potentially expanding onshore CO2 networks out to include more remote emitters. And that is the end of my presentation. So I guess on that note, I'd be very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Okay. Thanks very much, Luke. That's really excellent. Can I just ask you a question first?
Please.
As chairman's privilege, you mentioned green investment. Do you think CCS is seen as green?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, I do. Yeah.
Even though people talk about things like blue hydrogen and rather than green hydrogen.
Well, I think so. I think that's primarily a conversation that happens at the European level rather than here in the UK. So
okay, yeah.
No, it's been very interesting actually. So we've been doing quite a lot of engagement with with different stakeholders and NGOs and so forth, and I would say just generally very, very wide acceptance that this is going to be really important going forward. So I think some of the kind of intrinsic resistance to CCS that maybe there was, a few years ago, I just don't sense it's there as strongly now.
That's very good. Okay, some questions. So Paolo had a question. Do you want to come on and ask your question, Paolo? Paolo Prinzel, you had a question on the chat. Paolo, can you, so he's unmuted. We don't seem to be able to hear the question, so I'll ask it anyway. Luke, what's your assessment of government participation, finance-wise, in hubs like Humber and Teesside? Any idea what fraction we're looking at?
So I think it's a bit too early to say. I mean, I think the key point here is that the business models are absolutely key. So it's kind of interesting that there is a lot of attention now on the infrastructure fund, but actually, if you look at where the real value sits, it's in the investment instruments. You know, that's where over time you'll be able to recover your obviously your capital costs. You'll be recovering your operating costs. So in terms of direct government subsidy, I suspect it will be a relatively small part of the overall investment needs. But that said, as we've identified on that last slide, we think that there are a number of areas where those funds can very sensibly be targeted.
Okay, and then Stuart, you want to ask about confidence?
Hold on. Same sort of question in a way, so I expect you to give me the same sort of answer that, usually in competition rules and in common sense, then no government in their right mind is just going to pay for 100% of all this. So they want 50% or 70% of the money to come from businesses or industries of one sort or another. And because those businesses and industries have got other options around the world, and have also had their fingers burned by the UK and this particular technology, how do you think the confidence of those big investors is sitting? Because as you just said, they need to be able to get their money back off the capital expenditure and particularly off the operating revenue. So they'll want a 5% or 7% guaranteed return for 30 years or something.
Yes. So I think confidence is coming back, and we've not got here overnight. I mean, as you well know, quite a number of people on this call will know, the last competition was ended in 2015, and government started to look seriously again at CCUS around 2017. So it's taken a long time to get us to the point where we are today. But I think what has happened over the last 3 years is that I think confidence is building on both sides. And I must say as well, I mean, my interest is in representing industry. So it's been very important to take steps that will provide industry with the confidence to invest. But also we were faced with a situation where I think there was a lack of confidence within government on its ability to deliver CCS. So we've also had to work quite closely with government to make sure that we were coming forward with proposals that that they were also comfortable with. So I feel that the confidence is there. I think that the understanding from government about why CCUS is important is much deeper than it was even 4 or 5 years ago, certainly pre-Paris. But also, I guess I would note as well that I think we now have a much deeper pool of industrial companies that want to develop these projects. I think the understanding of the importance of this within the private sector is much higher than it was, again, pre the Paris Agreement.
Just a quick flyer on that then.
All right.
No, carry on, Stuart, sorry.
All right. So those are good reasons, but still, in a way, if I'm a hard-headed financier, those are all soft sentiment reasons.
Absolutely.
And if I've got the opportunity to invest in 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, which is proven technology, and we know there's going to be a revenue because Europe will be networked and everybody will want to buy that decarbonised electricity, then why should I take a punt on CCS? Am I going to do that because I get a bigger return? Or is it because I totally believe what Boris tells me?
It will. So I think ultimately it will be because you will have an instrument, a contract signed that will give you the equivalent confidence that a offshore wind CFD will give you.
So I think that's a really good point. So it still comes down to the viability and confidence of the business models. So I'm still worried, I suppose, concerned, worried, bothered that, as you said earlier on, we've only got a CFD for gas fuel power plant that BEIS are happy with, and all the other strands of income for CCS still seem to be nebulous to absent.
Agreed, absolutely. And that is a source of frequent conversation now with BEIS around the need to make progress on those business models. And in particular, the need to make progress on that before the projects move into their feed. So it's a very, I think it's well understood by both sides.
Great, yep, okay. That wasn't a criticism of you. I think you've laid out the situation really clearly. But BEIS need to make some decisions and then invent some stuff, I guess.
Yes, yes. And I guess for those of you that don't follow the BEIS policy development processes as forensically as some of the rest of us do, they did undertake a CCUS business model consultation last summer, July 2019. That was due to be published at the end of last year. We then had a general election, so that was then due to be published, expectation around March, and obviously the COVID crisis has come along, and quite rightly, government's attention has been taken elsewhere. But it does mean that consultation is very, very delayed, and we are making the case to government that they should be looking to try and release that as soon as practicable.
And just on that, we've heard about a CFD for power, which is, I guess, still not thoroughly detailed. What is the sort of suggestion on the other aspects, on the hydrogen and capture from industry and things like that?
Yeah, so I think the CFD model has a lot of attraction within government. I think it's a concept that they understand. So, yeah, obviously we don't yet know where government are, because their consultation response is 6 months late. But there is a lot of interest in looking at potentially a CO2 CFD, so that you can start to incentivize the capture of industrial emissions. I mean, there's some interesting challenges around what the right market price should be for carbon, and then also looking at the potential for essentially a gas CFD, which would reward essentially the cleaning up of gas through the provision of clean hydrogen. So that very much seems to be the direction of travel. In terms of greenhouse gas removals, I think the bit that concerns me there is that there's really no kind of clear policies on the table yet around how we're going to be incentivizing negative emissions. So for the first couple of projects, we can probably use a contract for difference in the power sector, but we do need a more enduring regime for that.
Yes, and have you heard anything about electricity market reforms, or whatever they would be called now? Because that was on the cards, wasn't it, a while ago?
It was, yes.
Because with more and more subsidised electricity, the concept of a market is getting harder and harder to.
It is, and I think this was kind of one of the issues that was expected to be addressed in, well, what's a now mythical energy white paper that I think we've been waiting for possibly 18 months or so. I am probably not as close to that conversation as others, but my sense is it's gone slightly into the long grass there.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, there's lots of other more important things to deal with.
Yes.
Yeah. John Newbury, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you want to just introduce yourself to Luke, John, just very quickly?
Okay, hi Luke. Yeah, my name's John Newbury, chemical engineer, now sat at home on furlough, just taking a little bit of an interest in what's going on and asking a few questions from time to time. Do have some involvement with some renewable energy, but not a lot with carbon capture and storage. So it's just something I've been following. And I'm also thinking around, well, okay, where does this lead in terms of a business? And at the moment, most of what you're talking about is capturing UK emissions and putting them in a hole in the ground, which adds a cost to industry. But we've got obviously quite a big resource compared to some other countries in terms of reservoir space to put carbon dioxide in. So while it may be a dirty industry to take someone else's waste and put it in a hole in the ground, if we can charge them for it, then it becomes a business. And I'm just wondering where that fits in to the thinking. it doesn't seem to be a separate line in there. But in terms of creating some value, if there are ships turning up with carbon dioxide on and we're pumping them safely away into the ground, then that's a good way of getting things up and running. And if a business closes and isn't generating the carbon dioxide that it was, then you'd still be able to use the facility. It wouldn't become stranded if you were importing from other countries at the right sort of cost or price.
Yeah, very good question, John. And I think you're absolutely right to pick up on that as an opportunity. And our Norwegian friends, I think, are already slightly ahead of the curve of us here in the UK, in that they are already actively progressing essentially an internationally accessible geological store. So you may have picked up, I think it's probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago, there was an announcement by a number of industrials that they've taken a decision to progress with a project known as Northern Lights. That's a large storage project located on the Norwegian continental shelf, and subject to the Ministry of Petroleum's approval, that project will go ahead. And while the initial volumes of CO2 are going to be Norwegian, the wider investment is predicated on the ability to bring in CO2 from countries outside of Norway. And actually, it's been very interesting in that as the Northern Lights projects have gone around and have started to engage with emitters, they've just found a tremendous appetite from emitters located around the North Sea, located around the Baltic Sea, to try and identify solutions to address their CO2 emissions. So we have plenty of storage capacity here in the UK, and I, for one, would be very keen to see the UK government show a bit more interest in this as a business opportunity going forward.
Yeah, but it didn't seem to feature in your plans and roadmaps 2030. It just doesn't seem to be there. I'm wondering why that's the case.
So I always work on the basis that you never really want more than about 2 or 3 asks for any minister at any one point in time. And so for us, if we could wake up on the 7th of July and have a government that's committed to developing 10 million tonnes of CO2 by 2030 across multiple clusters, then that would just be a huge step forward. And so we've just been very focused on trying to land that message. Obviously, as soon as they commit to that, then we'll try and think of some new targets for them. And it may well be that international storage of CO2 will be one of those. So it's all trying to kind of pick our kind of battles one by one.
Just quickly on that then, Luke, a number of the clusters already have shipping for you from other UK sources, don't they?
They're certainly looking at it, yes. And actually, I mean, probably, John, actually, I probably haven't answered your question fairly there, in that actually some of the projects are being a bit more proactive in that conversation and are starting to promote the opportunity to store third country volumes, but it's not yet kind of really embedded in UK government policy. But
it's a way of directly getting revenue streams, and it also means we're not dependent upon a British industrial strategy, which may not come off. There is a risk that we see quite a contraction in British industry over the next few years. So then you might be left with things stranded. Whereas if you've got the store and what you're doing is basically putting carbon dioxide in it, you've got the flexibility. It seems strange that our priority is more around clusters and sequestering what we're producing at the moment, rather than getting carbon dioxide under the ground and guaranteeing an income stream when we've got such a balance of payments deficit.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is driven, by the UK's legally binding net zero target, which means we absolutely have to get this away. But I think these issues will come on to the will come to the fore more going forward. But at the moment, we just need to get the right level of ambition. For projects that, I mean, in terms of kind of where we are at the moment, what keeps many of us awake is how these projects can be moved forward into their feed study later on this year. So that's, it's a very, very pressing issue that we're trying to address here, which is perhaps why we're focusing on it so much. But I think these other issues are there and they will come to the fore.
I mean, there is also a real incentive to try and maintain jobs in the UK by offering low carbon clusters where industry can continue or new industry can be sited. And there's a lot of places in Europe and in the world generally that don't have that option. They don't have the geology and the geography. So I think that's a bigger play, wouldn't you say, Luke, than importing CO2, although that's obviously something else you can do.
Yes.
I mean, Norway doesn't have the option of really having massive amounts of industry. It's very short on CO2.
Yes, yeah.
Different market. I'll ask Karis to say something before we won't be finishing yet, but Karis, do you want to introduce a poll?
I was just going to ask if you don't mind, if we just do a quick poll just to kind of gauge the audience that we've got today and then carry on with the discussion. The poll can be in the background. Is that okay with you, Luke?
Absolutely, yep.
Great, thank you.
How will it appear to people, Karis? Oh.
That should appear now.
Perfect, okay.
Great.
Right.
Yeah, I'll leave you to it. Sorry.
Okay, thanks. Luke, a question. You mentioned a while ago, Kyoto. What's the latest on the COP? I'm trying to keep up with it.
I believe first 2 weeks of November 2021. 1st to the 12th.
That's really quite a long time away, isn't it? But
absolutely.
Gives us time to at least get something done.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. And how much do you think that is driving policy? I guess it still is, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think there's a genuine interest in demonstrating leadership. But maybe I'm slightly cynical here. I think kind of politicians are mainly focused on, their immediate electorate. And so I still feel that it's probably domestic political considerations that really drives a lot of the behaviours that we see, and for a significant part of the electorate, particularly the younger fraction, climate change is important, and the government needs to be seen to be active in this space and sincere. And so I think that has been what's really probably changed the perception of the importance of climate change within the Conservative Party over the last 5 or 6 years. Now, I think the other interesting dynamic here as well, sticking with my theme of politicians primarily being interested in the electorate, is the new Conservative heartlands of the Northeast and the Yorkshire Humber, these industrial regions where it used to be very, very challenging to find Conservative MPs with an interest in CCS, now have a lot of new MPs there. And so I think there's also a tremendous desire to be seen to be doing something in these regions and trying to support the jobs there. So I think some of those angles are really, really important drivers here. I mean, that's why we tend to talk a lot about the levelling up agenda around diversification of the oil and gas supply chain, because these are very live issues that politicians really do care about.
Yes. And for some of our younger audience, and maybe people who are doing a PhD now, what do you think the job prospects are in the longer term in the CCS industry for that sort of person? I mean, we talked about kind of metal bashing jobs or construction jobs. Do you think there's going to be much in the way for researchers or people with a research background who want to maybe move into perhaps a slightly different area from their PhD even, Luke?
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about CCS, and even over, there are some pretty tough years, when the last competition ended, but the evidence was still very, very strong that this will be a sector that's going to be needed at a very, very significant scale. And all of the evidence still points in that direction. We will need to see very, very rapid growth in CCS deployment. At a minimum, it's likely to have growth rates that are probably higher than the committee than what we've done historically with offshore wind. So I sense it's going to have to be a big industry with substantial employment opportunities. I think where there is a very interesting conversation happening at the moment is around thinking about where we perhaps got it wrong with offshore wind. So, we genuinely do have a world-class offshore wind sector in terms of the scale of deployment, and we've done very well in terms of bringing costs of the technology down. But we've not done terribly well with the supply chain. And that has really, a lot of that value has been captured by other countries. Denmark is often put up as a good example. So I think there is a real desire with CCUS to try and think about how we start to capture some of the value of that supply chain. And one would hope that that would mean academics, researchers should have good prospects in this space.
That's very interesting. Just a quick question. I'll just ask it perhaps for speed, but is that 2030 report on your website already?
It should be, but I haven't had a look. If not, it will be very, very soon.
Yes. Okay, that's good. And then, are you getting any questions about post 2030? Because I have actually had a comment from some industry that even 10 million tonnes a year by 2030 wasn't a huge market, and I think they were focusing on 10 million rather, 10 million kind of in isolation rather than 10 million and then doubling every 5 forever, basically.
Yeah. So there's a kind of interesting. It kind of also comes back to question of tactics here, really. So when we were starting to think about this this paper and what the asks were going to be into government, we did have a conversation. Actually, should we be going higher? Should we be thinking about 30 or 40 million tonnes by 2030? And there's a lot of fairly good arguments you could put forward as to why that that might be desirable. I think in the end we took the decision that we felt that we were going with the general direction of government policy. We felt that it was something that we could win, and I think we were slightly worried that if we suddenly went for a much higher target, we might startle the horses somewhat, and potentially we could lose government on this, and they wouldn't consider us to be credible. So the general view was 10 million tonnes would be a game changer from where we are today, which is one project or one site in the mid-2020s and one by 2030, and that would be a huge win. Get that under our belt, and then we can start lobbying for the next ask.
Yeah, certainly going from 0 to nothing is always a big change, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Sorry, 0 to something rather than 0. Let's hope we don't do that. Tim, were you coming on to ask a question?
Hi, hi there. I'm really sorry, actually, Luke and John. I got the time wrong, so I've only just joined and I've missed your talk, Luke. But I think I know what you were going to say. But I just wanted to check that somebody had made the point, so it may have been made already, that in terms of putting CCS into stimulus packages, we have the great example from the US, from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act 2009 to cope with the financial crisis then. And part of that funded many different things like Tesla's first factory and lots of electric vehicle work, but it also funded Petronova, the ADM industrial project, and also the Port Arthur project, 3 full-scale CCS projects. So I hope you can use those examples, Luke, in your work with UK government.
Did it also fund Kemper, Tim?
It would have done, but Kemper didn't proceed, obviously. Yeah, I think Kemper was in that list.
And FutureGen and a few other things.
Yeah, but three that went operational. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and you'll recall as well, Tim, that there was also a European stimulus package, which included CCS, and that actually ended up funding some of the work that's been done on the Endurance geological store, which is now being investigated by some of the current clusters here in the UK.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah, thanks for that reminder. Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the time period is or likely to be? I mean, the American Recovery Act had a fixed time period. Any thoughts on that, Luke?
None, no. Unfortunately, yeah, our contacts aren't that senior. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that CCUS is part of that conversation. Judging by the comments from ministers and so forth, but we certainly aren't privy to kind of any real detail around what the timeframes might be, other than well. So I guess one important date that's worth remembering is that there will be another general election in 2024. So I suspect projects that can be underway before the next general election will be doing very well, especially if they can have a chancellor in a hard hat posing in front of them by 2024. But I'm back on my theme of politicians targeting investments that really mean something for their local constituencies.
Well, and if it's going to do something for the economy, it's got to go.
It's a win-win, absolutely, absolutely.
Very, very interesting. Okay, well, we're getting to the end. I guess I've got sort of a bit of a question, Luke. How have you found COVID affecting your work, and what would you most like to do, not personally, but within the CCSA, when meeting restrictions are lifted?
Right. So COVID has actually been much less disruptive than I'd anticipated, and I think what we have been able to, I think actually generally 80% of our work has progressed very, very well to working virtually. And in many ways, actually, the virtual meeting systems means, as an organisation, in some ways, we're probably much more egalitarian. It's much easier for a wider range of organisations to participate in our work, rather than perhaps having a slight bias towards organisations that can regularly get to face-to-face meetings in London. So it's been, I guess, very good in that respect. What I am starting to notice, though, is the impact of a real lack of the opportunity for discussion, debate, some of the kind of personal interactions. And I think that's becoming more and more evident that there's something about virtual meetings that is lacking. And I think that one of the other things that we were really hoping to do this year as well was to have a couple of relatively high-profile events with lots of external stakeholders, where we could really try and raise the profile of CCS. So some of you will know that we normally have a reception on the House of Lords, which is a great way of being able to engage with a set of parliamentarians and other stakeholders. We held a large face-to-face conference last year. And I think realistically, both of those won't happen this year. So I think those type of activities where we can start to kind of not just talk to ourselves and talk to kind of fellow CCS enthusiasts, but also kind of engage with a wider set of people who wouldn't normally meet would be the one thing that I think we'll try and address when we come out of this situation.
Yeah, well, let's hope we can do it at some of these projects that are starting up as well. That would be quite something, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Luke. Thank you, everybody, for coming on. As traditional at the end of these meetings, I'll pass back to Caris for the advertising what's next.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming to talk to us today, Luke. It was really good to hear about that report and what you've got coming up. In terms of next week, so on Wednesday, we've got Niall McDowell coming to speak to us from Imperial College London about CCS and jobs, although he has a much fancier title than that. So that'll be on Wednesday, and we'll send out our usual email on Monday with all of the details for what's coming up over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, thank you again, Luke, for today.
Pleasure. Delighted to have so many people here, and hope you found it interesting.
It was really interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.